American Anthropological Association. I really am delighted to welcome you today to this discussion about human genetics and race. We're particularly glad to have with us two guests, Agustin Fuentes and Nicholas Wade. Now, Nicholas is no stranger to the association. He's a distinguished science writer who's worked for Nature, for Science, and now for the past several years with the New York Times, where he reports on a variety of science and technology issues, including, some of you may remember, some of the inside baseball discussion about wording changes in the preamble to the AAA's long-range plan a couple of years ago. He serves as the editor, the science editor for the New York Times, and his latest book, A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History, will be released by Penguin Press tomorrow, May 6th. Augustine, who's trained in both zoology and anthropology, is professor of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame, and his research examines the how and the why of being human, but also chasing monkeys in the jungles and cities of Asia, as well as working in the laboratory. Among his many publications is the 2012 book from the University of California Press that is called Race, Monogamy, and Other Lies They Told You, Busting Myths About Human Nature. So it is really a privilege to have Nicholas joining us on the eve of the publication of this book. I'm really glad to welcome you both here. I have first just a few mechanics for the audience. Your phones have all been muted, but we welcome your questions and comments. Please direct your attention to the lower right-hand corner of your screen where you'll see two boxes. One is a chat box and one is a Q&A box. In both cases, you can designate to whom you want to send either your chat or your question or comment. If you would like for me to try to introduce it into the conversation, then address it either to the host or to me, and of course you're free, if you feel like it, to share it with the rest of the organization. Those boxes will not be available if you are in the full screen view. So I would encourage you to be able to follow the chat stream by staying out of the full screen view. So we had agreed originally that Nicholas would begin and spend a bit of time outlining the main argument of his book and then let Augustine follow. But as you probably heard, Nicholas is still having some technical difficulties, and so we're going to ask a slight change of order here for Augustine to proceed first, and I am going to meddle as appropriate in my role as the moderator. Just a couple of other words I'd like to share. The question has come up, why should we care about this topic? And as Nicholas says in his book, we think it's enormously important to have a public conversation about race and human variation, what for many is a very difficult subject. Now, I thank our colleague and former association president, Alan Goodman, for pointing out that human biological variation is wonderfully complex and sometimes geographically patterned. Also that race is an idea about human variation that was invented and reified and made real by constant use to describe the structure of human variation. Anthropologists have long been among the proponents of various concepts of race, sometimes to ill effect. Race is a deeply held idea with political and social and economic power. So we acknowledge that race is enormously important in history and as a social reality. The question that we'd like to discuss is whether it's a useful way of describing human biological variation. And that's really why we're here today. And with that, I'm going to turn the control. Oh, I see that Nicholas is joining us, but why don't we go ahead anyhow, Augustine, and I'm going to turn the control over to you. And as soon as we have video feed for Nicholas, we'll introduce him again properly. So, Augustine, the floor is all yours.
All right. Well, not knowing what the time range is here, I'll just start the general overview and see if we pan out. I'd like to say that Nicholas Wade made two assertions that underlie his whole argument. It's sort of everything he rests on these two basic assertions. And those two assertions are as follows. Number one, humans are divided into 5 genetically identified continental races, or maybe 3 or 7, depending on where you are in the book. And number two, that there's significant differences in the genetically based social behaviors between these races, and that those differences have shown up in the last 15 to 50,000 years of human evolution. Those are two major assertions. Everything else he says is based on these two assertions. So humans, these two assertions then are drawn from a set of data and theories. And those two sets of data are human genetic variation and human evolution. But what I'd like to point out here, and just to be blunt, is that Mr. Wade gets both the data and the interpretation very wrong in both of these areas. Let me explain how. First, a few points about human variation. So we know that genes don't do anything by themselves. Epigenetics and complex metabolic and developmental systems sort of impact the way bodies and behaviors work. Remember, the roundworm, C. elegans, this little roundworm, has about 20,000 genes. Humans have about 23,000 genes. And I'd like to think, and I think most people agree, that humans are more than 15% more complex than roundworms. So genes matter, but they're just a small part of the whole evolutionary picture. Second thing that's important to clear up here is that if you're making a scientific argument about genetic variation, you need to focus on population. And you have to be clear about your definition. Wade uses the words cluster, population, group, race, subrace, ethnicity in a range of ways with few concrete definitions and occasionally interchangeably throughout the book. So those two things we got to be clear about. But the real question is, what does human genetic variation actually look like? Right? Are there 5 or 3 or 7 continental races? All right, first a few basics. Humans all share 100% of all of their genes, right? And about 99.9% of variation. That means the variation we're interested in is 0.1% of all the variation in the genome. Now, not to say that variation isn't important. It's very important, but it's only 0.1% of all the variation we have. So the vast majority of DNA, right, that varies in this 0.1% is not actually in the genes themselves. So it's not shaped by natural selection in the way that Wade's argument did. Also, most variation in human genetics is due to gene flow and genetic drift, which basically means that the further apart two populations are, the more differences there are going to be between them. So most of our variation looks like this. And if I could have the first slide there. Oh, I have the first slide. Can you see this slide here? Anyone?
Yes.
Yes? Yes, okay. So if you look at this is the variation of all human genetic variation on the planet, and you can see that the variation within African populations has almost all of it, and then the variation outside of populations in Africa is sort of what makes up the very small amount of the overall population. Now, if we just look at that variation within Africa, here's a recent publication from Sarah Tishoff and colleagues. There's huge variation in Africa, and even this is just a very small sample of it. So that's what human variation generally looks like. However, we go to the next one here. We ask the question, is there any evidence that it really breaks us up into 5 continental patterns like this? Well, let's take a look. If you do, as some of the studies Wade relies on do, compare populations of people from Nigeria, Western Europe, Beijing, and Tokyo, as you can see outlined here, you get some pattern differences. But each of these populations do not reflect the entire continental areas of Africa, Asia, and Europe. If you compare separated populations within the continental areas, you get the exact same kind of variation. So comparing 60 Nigerians to 60 European descent Americans to 89 people from Beijing and Tokyo gives you the exact same kind of patterns of differences if you were to compare people from, say, Siberia, Tibet, and Java, or, for example, if you were to compare people from Finland, Wales, and Yemen, or even, and importantly, if you were to compare people from Somalia, Liberia, and South Africa. None of these things give us races. They give us populational differences. And if you compare the level of differences between any of these populations and use the same number, the same figure that zoologists who do this for mammals all the time, use that same number that they use to say, is this a separate race or subspecies, then no human populations meet that level, meet that criteria. So for zoologists, no human populations are different enough from one another to be called separate subspecies. However, you could, as many people do, take a bunch of human variation data. Here on the left, you can see it, where we have about 1,000 people from 51 populations on the planet. And you can just color code them by the general region there of the planet they're from. You can see Africa, East Asia, Oceania, Eurasia, something like that. And then you can see what looks like some sort of pattern continental distinctions and distribution. However, if you actually show each individual of this 1,000 people color-coded to the population they're associated with, you see that you have no real clear continental pattern, and that you have some separation by geographic distance pattern and lots of variation in the overall tree. And I'm going to give you back now, Ed, the control here, and go back to just the image. So the point being, you're going to hear from Mr. Wade that there are 5 or 3 or 7 different clusters of humans. Now, the way in which you can take genetic data and make them back clusters is to use a program, for example, called Cluster, which was used by the Rosenberg team, from which data you'll see from Mr. Wade and that he uses in his book. This computer program cluster takes a bunch of data, and then you basically tell it to put it into 3 groups or 4 groups or 5 groups or 7 groups and see which way is easiest. Now, the originator of this program, a guy named Pritchard, has said that applying this program to the distribution of data, if those data are genetic data that are influenced by gene flow, restricted gene flow, and isolation by distance, then the numbers of clusters you're going to get are reasonably arbitrary. So when you're comparing 2 populations, or 3 populations, or 5 populations, the way in which you analyze those clusters is going to give you different kinds of results. None of the results from these comparisons ubiquitously give us a single 3 or 5 or 7 or 14 or 18 or 20 comparison. So when Mr. Wade states in his chapter 5 that it might be reasonable to elevate all Indian and Middle Eastern groups to the level of major races, making 7 in all, he notices a problem. Quote, but then many more subpopulations could be declared races. He also then has a solution to this. Quote, so to keep things simple, the 5-race continent-based scheme seems the most practical for most purposes. Sure, this is practical if your purpose is to maintain the myth that Black, white, and Asian are separable biological groups. But if your goal is to accurately reflect what we know about human genetic and population diversity, then it's not really practical at all. In fact, it's flat out wrong. What we know about human genetic variation does not support dividing humans into 3 or 5 or 7 discrete clusters. I could go on about the evolution stuff, but I see Mr. Wade is on, and this is probably a good jumping off place to go back and forth.
Okay, thanks very much, Augustine. And now, Nicholas, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I am glad to see that you've been able to join us. And I would welcome for you to have the opportunity, if you don't mind, just to begin by telling us why you decided to write this book, and maybe outline the main argument that you have to offer in the book itself. So, Nicholas, sure. There you go.
So is that we had the technical difficulties joining? So can you see and hear me at this time?
Yes, both.
Oh,
yes,
that's wonderful. Okay. Well, I'll start, I think, by noting it's often puzzling for an audience when speakers come at it from diametrically opposing points of view. And I'm just going to sketch in a little bit historical background because we'll make that a little clearer for our viewers. And it all goes back to an anthropologist called Ashley Montagu, who was a tireless campaigner against racism in the 1950s and onwards. And he believed that if he could persuade people that racism did not exist at all, he could slay the three dragons of racism, colonialism, and imperialism. And to a remarkable extent, he was successful. So at the time, in the 1950s, the battle for civil rights had not been won. No one really understood the sort of genetic structure of race, and people went along with this idea that races do not exist. So particularly in the social sciences, it hardened into a dogma that race has no biological basis, and that is the intellectual tradition that Dr. Fuentes has ably presented to us this morning. Now, where I come in is I'm a science journalist, and for the last 10 years, I've been watching with great interest information flowing out of the Human Genome Project, which bears on recent human evolution and therefore on the differentiation of our ancestral population into different races. But I've been surprised to see that no scientists started to put all the pieces together, and that is because scientists are afraid to talk about race. They know that they risk being denounced as racists and having their careers destroyed if they even mention the subject, so they refer to it instead in code words. So I decided I would write a book that explained what we know about race and what the consequences might be. And I think Montagu made a terrible mistake, even though I completely share his motives. I think that it's best to say racism is wrong as a matter of principle, as a matter of absolute principle. And that way, you don't care what the science says, because you're not going to change your mind about your principles. If, however, you link your opposition to racism to the science coming out a particular way, and you turn out to be wrong, then you have undermined your whole case. And the other downside of this position is, of course, if you entangle politics with science, you risk distorting the science, and that is exactly what has happened. So this is what we can. This is our best understanding of race as I view it. The easiest way to think of human races is in terms of population splits, because evolution is an ongoing, dynamic process, and unless everyone is breeding into the same gene pool, then you will get variation in speciation. So any barrier to free reproduction will set you on the path for a species to vary. So nothing could be a more formidable barrier than to have one little group sort of migrate away from its parent group and never come in touch with them again for thousands of years. So this is what has happened to the human population historically. So the first major split in the human population occurred 50,000 years ago, and it's between Africans and non-Africans. Then there's another big split, which occurred about 30,000 years ago. We don't understand it very well at this point, but basically it was between the people inhabiting the west half and the east half of the Eurasian continent. So you have East Asians in the east half, and people we'll call Caucasians in the west half. So Caucasians includes Europeans, Middle Easterners, and people of the Indian subcontinent. So this is quite a profound split because we know that because we now understand the genes that are responsible for skin color. So both Caucasians and East Asians have very pale skin, but it's through entirely different genetic methods. So they evolved. This is an instance of independent parallel evolution. They evolved pale skin in different ways. So this gives you a three-way split in the population, which corresponds robustly to the three races that everyone can recognize at a glance: Africans, East Asians, Europeans. The situation is more complicated than that, of course, but don't throw common sense out of the window if it's helping. Now, a fourth race are the Australian Aborigines, because they split off from the main emigration from Africa very early. They reached Australia 44,000 years ago, managed to keep off all outsiders until a very recent time. So even though Aborigines are very small in numbers, you can consider them to be a continental race. And the fifth race would be Native Americans who started to inhabit the continent about 15,000 years ago. So there you have sort of split into five races. Now, if you look at genomic data, you can see that confirmed in the genome. We've had two global genomic surveys. So the first one, what you do, you sample the genome of about 400 sites where people differ. For most, about 3 billion pairs were exactly the same, and that's not informative. You look for sites of difference. You sample genomes of people around the world at 400 sites, and you then ask this computer program that Augustine refers to. It's called structure, not cluster. Cluster is a later variation. So you tell structure you've got these genomes, and you want them to be put into groups or clusters, and each genome is to go in the group that it has most variation in common with. So then you have to tell the computer how many clusters you want. So if I could have the first side first, that is the second, I think. I want the one before that. That's it. Okay, so these numbers are a little small, but the top row, you've got two clusters. It's not very informative. At k equals 5, which is the row 1 from the bottom, you see the global human population has divided itself very neatly into 5 clusters represented by the 5 colors. And these correspond robustly to the 5 continental races that I described to you, Africans being brown and Caucasians being blue, East Asians being pink, the Aborigines, people of Papua New Guinea are green, and Africans, where can I put this? It's getting Africans, Caucasians, East Asians, Aborigines, and these must be Native Americans, purple at the extreme right. Now you'll see that many of these, each little box, you can just see the black line, represents one particular ethnicity. So you can, some of these boxes have 2 colors in them. So particularly at the right-hand side of the blue box, you'll see people from Central Asia who are partly European and partly East Asian. So that box has mixed blue and pink, which is just what you would expect. The East Asians being sort of crossroad populations. Now, if you go to k equals 6, you suddenly get this little yellow group appearing. That's the Kalash population in Pakistan or genetics, and that doesn't make any sense. So this is an easy way of visualizing how the world's populations cluster together in groups that we can call races, because that corresponds very robustly to our notion of race. Now, if I could have the next slide. So this is just to show that you can take this further down. You can subdivide each race into groups that, if you want to avoid the term subraces, you can call ethnicities. I know anthropologists use that word in a slightly different sense. Now another thing we can learn from genetics is that we can see the fingerprints of natural selection in action. So this is done statistically. I probably don't have time to describe this how it's done. If you look, if I have the next slide, if you look at the three major races, you'll see genes that are under selection in each of them. But in each race, a different group of genes is under selection. So this is East Asians at the top, Africans at the right, and Caucasians or Europeans rather to the left. So you can see in each group there are roughly 200 genes under the recent force of natural selection, and most of them are particular to a single race and are not shared in common with other races. So this is a very interesting result, and it's not in any way surprising. It simply means that in each continent, in each region of the world, populations have adapted, have evolved to their local circumstances. Now, another thing we can learn from this is that we can look at those genes under selection and ask what they do. Now, our ignorance of the genome is such that in most cases we've got no idea what specific role these genes play, but we can assign them to sort of general categories. And the kind of genes under selection are ones that deal with skin color, that deal with nutrition, and there are some that deal with brain function. We've no idea what they do. My belief, which I explore in the book, is they have to do with human social behavior and generate societies of slightly different flavor. But I don't have time to pursue that here. So this tells us a lot about the nature of human variation. And I think I'd now like to briefly explain to you what we know about the genetic structure of races. So you might think that different races would have different genes, but as Augustine just explained, all humans have exactly the same genes, so far as we know. Now, genes come in different flavors that are called alleles, and there might be sort of 1 or 20 or 200 different alleles of any particular gene in a population. So your next thought might be, well, races differ because they have different alleles. You'll find allele A in one race and allele B in another race. But again, this is not how the system works. There are a few alleles that are very skewed in frequency in that way, but they don't in any way explain the basis of race. The basis of racial differences is something quite subtle. It is what we call allele frequencies. So that means if an allele has a frequency or a percentage of 20% in one race and 80% in another race, this is the basis of racial difference. So you might think, well, how can that be? It makes no sense. And it doesn't until you consider that most human traits are subject to many genes acting in concert. And so if you take height, and there are at least 50 different genes that affect height. Now let's imagine we have two populations, the Nuer of the southern Sudan are very tall, and the Biaka of the Central African forest are very short. Now suppose 50 genes, and each of these height-influencing genes comes in two forms: a height-enhancing gene, a height-enhancing allele, and a height-neutral allele. And let's also suppose that among the Nuer, at each of these sites, the height-enhancing allele is present in 95% of the population, and 5% of the population has the height-neutral allele. And the Biaka pygmies, it's going to be the other way around. 95% of people will have at all these 50 sites the height-neutral, and only 5% will have the height-enhancing. Now, if you're a baby born into a Nuer community, consider your chances of inheriting these 50 height genomes. You have an overwhelming chance of inheriting the height-enhancing allele at each of these 50 sites. You'll probably have 46, 47 of the height-enhancing alleles, and so you'll be very tall. Whereas if you're a pygmy, your chances are reversed. You'll have a 95% chance of inheriting the height-neutral alleles at all these sites, and a very small chance of the height-enhancing ones. So if you're comparing the genomes of these two populations, the genetics will say, well, I can't see any absolute difference. They've got the same alleles, and so they have. But when you look at the allele frequencies make a big difference to the physical traits of these two populations. So that is the genetic basis of race, and that is why I think we can say with confidence that human races do exist, and that's the science of it.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I want to jump in here right now and try to make the leap between the description of genetic variation that you've offered here and the behavioral variation that somehow leads to reproductive success in different amounts. One question that we have from the audience is phrased first as a comment with a premise that says important and costly human adaptations include long childhood, enhanced recality, large brains, and they seem to design to reduce the reliance on built-in social behaviors. From this, one would expect genetic patterning of social behavior to have been strongly selected against. Do you have a comment on that?
No, I don't follow the argument at all. I mean, we're a highly social species, and we survive not as individuals, but as social groups. And I think natural selection would pay intense selection to the nature of our societies, and therefore to the social behavior on which a society depends. So we haven't yet had much success in identifying these genes, but we have made a start in the form of genes like oxytocin, and which promote sociality. And I think we clearly say sociality is under genetic influence.
Yeah. So Augustine, could you help us understand your views on the relationship between genetic variation and behavioral variation?
Yes, I can very much, but if you give me 2 minutes, I need to just respond to one of the things here that Nicholas said, which I think is extremely important, and it goes back to my original point. We can get the genetic variation and behavioral variation, but we really need to define what we're talking about with races. And I think it's really important to go back to the structure program and Rosenberg's original publication, that image that Nicholas just showed us with those 6 things. You know, Rosenberg, when they ran it, they actually ran up to 20 different variations. If you go back one stage, so you can see here K2 through 6. Well, they actually ran it up to K20, and the bigger you get, the more unwieldy it gets, but the more accurately it reflects the variation. And if you go to the next slide really quickly that he showed, I just want to point out the one with the circles around. If you go to those circles, that's from Boyce et al. 2008, and they show sort of areas under selection, in particular in these 3 populations. And these are the 3 ones I referred to. These 3 populations, which Nicholas has been referring to as races, are 60 individuals from Nigeria, 60 individuals from the Americas who are European descendants, and 89 people from Beijing and Tokyo. They don't reflect the whole human race. And if you look up in the left corner, you'll see 26,374 areas where there was no difference at all. So these differences are teeny. I just think that's important to get in there. As far as the genetics of behavior, we need to realize that genes don't lead to behavior. Genes interact with other genes, with epigenetic effects, with developmental effects, with proteomic effects, with metabolic effects. So the whole idea is that we can identify simple genes underlying behaviors is not the way we think of evolutionary biology today. We think of evolutionary biology as complex systems in which genes are participants. And so to try to sort of get away from all of the other components and just talk about the genes doesn't get us very far, and especially if what we're doing is comparing small disparate populations and teeny percentages of patterns of genetic variation. What we really want to be asking is, what do humans do, and what do we know from evolutionary biology, and how do these things mix together? And I think staying to the science is really important. Nicholas referenced Ashley Montague, who's an anthropologist, and that's fine. Maybe there are a lot of political issues here. There certainly are. But what I want to do is focus in the actual science, because that's a place we have to start. We have to show the dynamic and reality of the science and the genetic data before we can begin talking about these larger issues.
Thank you. Nicholas, do you have a response to Augustine before I go to another question?
Yeah, sure. I think Augustine is trying to go for what I would call obfuscation, and I'm trying to go for clarity. I mean, human genetics is a complicated subject, so you have to start by looking for clarifying principles, or you'll never understand it. So the 3 circles that Pritchard has showed in the diagram that's still up, sure, this is a very early study, but it's quite wrong to dismiss these people, these individuals, as being unrepresentative. And this is how you start. These are the very populations chosen by the HapMap project in the hope of understanding the basis of human disease, which impacts different races in different ways, and therefore you need to study them in each way. So this is a perfectly valid finding. It has been repeated by many other findings since looking for the fingerprints of natural selection. All of them have found that natural selection operates on a regional basis. So, I would reject Robertson's attempt to sort of pick this apart and say it means nothing. It's actually a rather robust finding.
Sorry.
Another point I forgot to make, which I think is a very simple way of understanding how well we understand race, is if you take someone from an admixed population, say African American, geneticists can now track their way along the genome of such an individual and assign each segment of the genome to an African ancestor or a European ancestor, which clearly this would be impossible if races did not exist. But they do exist, and you can easily see it in admixed populations. I mean, it's no big deal. It just seems to be so unsurprising. If you take any species and you distribute it all over the world, it's going to vary because that's how evolution works. As each population struggles to survive in its own local habitat. That's all that happened. Races just are a reflection of recent human evolution. And to deny them, it puts you in the category of a creation setting.
So I want to relay a comment, if I can bust in here for just a second. One of our attendees has pointed out that he believes that the clustering of human populations is much better established than implied by either Nicholas or Augustine. It's now based on hundreds of thousands of individuals for whom we have SNP genotypes. And so perhaps, lingering on just this one study or even one simulation is old news in itself at this point. But there is a question from the audience that asks, please, Nicholas, if you could you give us a biological definition of a race? If we were to examine the same global genetic variation in another non-human species, would there be enough genetic differentiation among populations to warrant significantly different biological groups? The observation is that humans show an extraordinary amount of genetic homogeneity compared to other species. For example, the genetic diversity in one chimpanzee population is greater than all the genetic diversity of humans worldwide. Would both of you care to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Let me take your first point first, which is the Rosenberg study. There have been only two of these studies. The Rosenberg study, one by Lee, and they're quite difficult to do because you have to sequence a large number of genomes throughout the globe. So both these studies have shown the same thing. The only difference was the Lee study, as you say, it cited, it looked at 650,000 sites, far more than the 400 sites of the Rosenberg study, and it gave you a much more detailed picture. But interestingly, it was very much the same as the Rosenberg study, the only difference being that you could split out the Caucasian group into two others, the Middle Easterners and the people of the Indian subcontinent, to split away as two extra groups. So if you wanted, you could say there are 7 human races instead of 5. But there's no need to get hung up on numbers here. Races are a very fluid, fuzzy context. It doesn't matter how many there are. The fact that people may differ on the number of races is simply a matter of definition and doesn't alter the fact that races exist. Now, to come to your second question about the variation, yeah, sure, humans are such a young species that we have far less variation than chimpanzees do. But it's hard to quantify variation. One gene can make a hell of a lot of difference, especially if it's a defective one that causes a disease or makes you unable to speak. So just a handful of genes can cause a big difference or a little difference. There's no metric for saying how much variation is significant and how much isn't. All we can tell is that although there is rather little, there is comparatively very little variation in the human population compared to other species. Nonetheless, because of the intense selective pressures we've been under the last 50,000 years, a considerable amount of variation has developed in human species, and that's why these races look somewhat different.
Thank you. Go ahead, Augustine.
I would like to just point out that there's very clearly the Lee study and the Rosenberg study are two of many, many studies that have actually looked at this. And the Lee study itself concludes, and I'm quoting from the Lee 2008 study, these results, however, say nothing about the origin and distribution of human phenotypic variation. The observed population structure can be largely explained by random drift at neutral loci, saying that it's not natural selection which Wade is arguing for. And also from another very similar study by Jing and colleagues in 2009, they say that in 1871, Charles Darwin noted in The Descent of Man, it may be doubted whether any character can be named which is distinctive of a race and it's constant. And our data affirm what Darwin believed. We found not a single SNP locus out of nearly 250,000 at which a fixed difference would distinguish any pair of continental populations. Bottom line here is, I'm not arguing that these variations don't exist, but Nicholas consistently said that they're reflective of races as opposed to populations. So we should go back to the question that came in before. If we're talking about biological differences, we need a biological definition of race. Is race one population of 60 Yoruban individuals or one population of 60 individuals in Beijing and Tokyo? We need an actual definition. Otherwise, we're just talking about really complicated variation. The idea that white, black, Asian are races, I think if you're going to make that argument, you need a definition. So what's the definition? We're still there.
Let me ask, you can think about that just a bit, and I'll relay some other questions that are here. The data on race being shown so far clearly show patterns, but perhaps these are patterns that could best be explained by geographical distance. How do we rule out geographical distance as the main factor explaining what some would say looks like race?
Well, geographical distance is important. So is natural selection. So is genetic drift. There's all of these different ways in which sort of the genes are affected. And remember, genes are only a teeny part of this whole story. But there are many ways. So the further apart populations are, the more little differences they're going to have. But the problem is if we compare just the population from West Africa and a population from Northern Europe and a population from East Asia, yeah, they're going to look different. But if we lined up population from West Africa all the way over to East Asia or all the way up to Europe, then you'd have consistent sort of patterns, and you wouldn't be able to divide it up into 5 things. You would see sort of patterns of slight change over time. That doesn't give us 5 races or 3 races or 7 races. That gives us one human race with some really interesting patterns of genetic variation.
Okay, I'm sorry to report that it looks as though Nicholas's technology problems have continued and that he's lost to us for just a minute. But while I have you, Augustine, I wonder if you could help me as a cultural anthropologist understand how people with zoology and biological anthropology training talk about the kinds of mechanisms that link human biological evolution with social evolution.
Right. So if we think about the ways in which humans evolve, or what we know about it right now, we know that obviously external environments influence organisms, and organisms respond to those environments. So that's sort of what Darwin told us. We've actually added a lot to our knowledge base about evolutionary biology since then. So, for example, we know that organisms working together can actually impact the environment. Earthworms do this, beavers do this, humans do this in an incredible way, and we call that niche construction. And so rather than just the environment shaping sort of organisms and their gene pools, we know that there's interaction between organisms and the environment, which actually changes the way natural selection works. So evolution is really ongoing over time and complex. So it's not just the environment targeting genes, it's actually organisms getting together in the environment with many other organisms working together. And so over time, evolution is really dynamic. But when it comes to humans, we have to think about things like cultural patterns, social histories, political institutions. All of those things structure the way we move, the way we mate, the way we interact. So all of that is part of human evolution. It's not just natural selection focusing on genes. It's actually a very, very complex systemic undertaking. And we know a lot about that. So the representation of like little teeny minute differences in some areas of the DNA and making those connected to large social, political, and historical differences, as Nicholas Wade did in his book, is, well, it's misleading because it's not giving true credit to evolutionary biology and complexity in the way we understand how things evolve.
Thanks for that. Here's a question from somebody in the audience there, and you may not be the best person to answer it, Augustine, but I'll pose it to you anyhow. Would you say that there's a difference between the concept of races in humans and, say, categories of animals, breeds of animals, different kinds of dogs, for example? And I don't mean to say anything but in an analogous form.
So here's the problem with talking about race, right? When we talk about race, we're always talking about two different things. On one hand, we're talking about a biological group, a biological category, which is called a subspecies or race by biologists and zoologists. On the other hand, we're talking about what we call race in humans, the socially constructed race: black, white, Asian, Latino. And those two things are actually separate. There's some relationship between the characteristics we use to assign them, but one is socially constructed and the other is biological. The short answer is, in humans, through every measure you take and go out until you get the literature, humans have one biological race. That is one subspecies currently. In the past, there may have been more. Neanderthals, maybe that was another human race. But now we only have one biological race. So let's take that off the table. Then we're struck with the thing with races in the United States, for example. Being black or white or Latino or Asian, Native American, that matters, and that has real implications. So these social realities of race are quite important. And a number of anthropologists are showing us really how the social realities of race, our histories and our social structures, have then health impacts and a wide variety of other impacts. So the biological race question is easy. There's one. The social race question is complicated because it's dynamic, but it's also very, very real and very, very powerful.
So would you agree with the accuracy of the statement that we find in The Troublesome Inheritance, the book, that it is the consensus explanation of almost all social scientists, that human societies differ only in their culture?
No. You know, there's a lot of, and I'm just really sorry that Nicholas Wade is not here anymore, because this is the conversation that we have. I am a social scientist. I don't think humans only differ in their culture. I just made the whole case that humans differ genetically a lot in many ways, in interesting ways. But what's most important is the actual science behind that variation. We know how that works. Humans differ in lots of ways, but not by biological race.
Okay, so I'm going to, because I don't want to read this all to you, maybe you could turn your eye to the chat window here.
Got it.
Oh, I'm sorry, this is actually, I do have to read it to you because it's addressed to me. So I wonder if you could comment on this observation by one of our audience members. And really, again, this is the sort of thing that I think, in all fairness.
I don't see myself. Oh, yes, okay. I see my little camera now. Click on that.
Okay. I'm so glad you're back, Nicholas, because now I have a question for you. If you can still hear me. Yes.
It's cycling in, I think.
Okay.
So I'm back with you, I think, if you can hear me.
Yes, I'm so sorry to have lost you, but there's a question that's come in from one of our audience members that goes something like this. The audience member says that it appears as though that the issue that you are evading is the use of the term race, which refers to a particular level of differentiation within a species. The level of differentiation that's required to make an identification to a population at whatever level is different than the level required to call them races or subspecies. The point's not that there's a difference, but how much differentiation there is and whether it has evolutionary significance. There are populations in this observer's view, but no races. Would you care to comment on that? And I know in your book at one point somebody is talking about, there's somewhere between 5 and 15% variation, and the question you raise is 15% significant, or is it no, never mind, in terms of the allelic frequency distribution?
Okay, sure. I should say I'm sorry I missed the last 5-10 minutes of our webinar because my connection's broken. So the question of how much differentiation do you need to declare something a race? I think one needs to emphasize that race is the biological variation is a continuum. So where you want to sort of cut this continuum is kind of arbitrary. Now, population geneticists have developed some measures called Wright's FST for measuring the amount of differentiation. And people like Richard Lewontin have said, well, the amount of differentiation we see in the human population is so small that race has no meaning. But that is a political judgment, and I believe it's wrong. Now, Saul Wright, who invented the FST measure, said that, well, if you get a differentiation of about 15%, that would count as a subspecies. You know, he's speaking to populations in general. So that happens to be about the amount of variation you see in the human population. So there's enough variation for you to say, well, these are subspecies or races within the single human species, if you wish to. And exactly how many of them there are is really a question of not very much interest. The whole system is continuous. There's an unbroken spectrum from races to the ethnicities within races. It all depends on how many genetic markers you wish to look at.
So can I weigh in here?
Go ahead.
I think that's a very good point, because FST is something that is used sort of standard-wise to look at populational structure within species. And so most people now would argue, yeah, between about 0.15 and 0.27 FSTs are what most zoologists would argue gives you potentially populations that are branching away from each other. It's important to point out that human populations on average are much lower than that. But let's even set that aside. We should point out that these kinds of patterns these kinds of patterns matter because understanding what we're comparing is really important. So, Nicholas, you keep mentioning that we all know for these races. So if we say African, what is the definition? We need a definition of this. It matters if it's 3 or 5 or 7, if these are actually evolutionary units or biological categories that we're using. If they're not, if we're just sort of saying, well, here's a bunch of variation, I'm going to call this, this, and that, that's one thing, but that's not science. So definitional matters are extremely important here.
So I'm pretty sure we're not going to resolve this question this afternoon, and we just have 2 minutes left. But I'd like to ask Nicholas one question, and then Augustine one question, and then thank you both for your time this afternoon. My question for Nicholas, at the start of your presentation, you said, and referring to Ashley Montague about this, I think, you said that social scientists are afraid to talk about race. I wonder if you could tell us the basis of this observation. That is, what is it that makes you think that social scientists are unwilling or afraid to talk about race?
Well, I should say the scientists are unwilling to talk about the biological basis of race. And this is a view that comes from social scientists who have wedded themselves to the doctrine which we see on the official websites of many of the large umbrella groups, saying that race does not have a biological basis. And this is carried over to the political climate in academia, which makes it very difficult for geneticists to talk about race. And indeed, they don't. It's not in their papers. They use code words like population structure, which means structure into races, or ancestry. They call it ancestry informative markers. So these are the markers you use to define what race a person is from. But they can't, they fear to say it because their careers will be destroyed. There's a truly oppressive atmosphere that I find when talking to geneticists. And what I very much hope is that the major social science groups would sort of relook at this question in the light of new knowledge and update their statements on race to reflect what we know scientifically, and not perpetuate this political road that Ashley Montague drove us down. I do think it's a mistake, and since I have the privilege of speaking to the executive director of the AAA, I would urge you to have some committees look at this again and see if you can't update your statement to be consonant with what we now know.
Thank you for that suggestion. I appreciate it. So, Augustine, I want to ask a question also derived from Nicholas's book. It was a point that I stopped and read over several times. Early on in the book, he reports the science is self-correcting, even if it takes considerable delay. But at the same time, it's essentially conservative. And then he has this lovely quote from Paul Samuelson, that science proceeds funeral by funeral. I love the image. And Augustine, I wonder if you would care to comment on your sense of the pace at which scientific knowledge advances.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to position what science is. And really, over the last 100 years, we've made enormous progress. And I think acknowledging that progress and understanding it is critically important. And I disagree with Nicholas that we're not engaging with the data. I mean, I have a stack right here. I don't want to show them all, but here's about 30 papers in the last 10 years that are on this exact topic. It's incredibly complicated, and we need to sort of move forward. And I think the science is, in fact, moving forward, but we need to talk about it accurately and effectively and actually reflect the debates and the discourse that are going on in science, not select just those that support a particular agenda or position. So what I think, and I agree with Nicholas here completely, we need to talk more about race. We need to talk about race clearly and factually. We need to not be afraid to get these kinds of discussions out there and have them in ways that are as accessible as possible. However, we have to accurately reflect the entire range of research that's going on, both in the social and the biological sciences, and we've got to encourage people to translate that information to the public in ways that they can access. Science does work, it works slowly, but it doesn't live outside of the broader culture in which it exists. So we need to talk more.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that subject, but unfortunately we cannot talk anymore this afternoon. So I once again want to thank you both, particularly Nicholas. I know this must be coming up on a busy time for you with the book to be released tomorrow, and Augustine, I know it's towards the end of your semester and papers to mark and this sort of thing. But thanks to both of you and to all of you who tuned in for the questions that you have. This event has been recorded. It will be available for streaming and for later inspection, as well as the public chat and Q&A transcripts. And so as both of our distinguished guest speakers have alluded to, we will continue this conversation in other forums, and I thank you both for giving us a chunk of your afternoon today. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks.
So,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. We'll sign off now.